In 1983, a Soviet military officer named Stanislav Petrov sat alone in a bunker outside Moscow. His radar screen showed 5 American nuclear missiles headed directly for the Soviet Union. His orders were clear: report the launch, trigger a Soviet response. What happened next would determine whether or not the world survived the night. Petrov hesitated. He made a decision, and life on Earth continued. This moment, one man, one decision, one radar screen, captures everything about the era we call the Cold War. A conflict with no official battlefield, no formal declaration of war, but one that shaped every nation, every government, and every human life on Earth for nearly half a century. This is the entire history of the Cold War. To understand the Cold War, we must first understand the world it was born into. In August 1945, the Second World War came to an end. The most destructive conflict in human history had killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people. But as the guns fell silent, 2 nations stood above the rubble of a broken world. The United States of America, an economic and military superpower, the only nation to have used a nuclear weapon in war, and the architect of the post-war Western economic order. And the Union of Soviet Socialist States, a vast communist state stretching across 11 time zones, battle-hardened after losing more than 27 million of its own citizens in the war against Nazi Germany. These 2 nations had fought on the same side during the Second World War, but they were united only by a common enemy. Their ideologies could not have been more different. The United States championed capitalism, liberal democracy, and individual freedom. The Soviet Union was built on communism, state ownership of industry, a one-party political system, and the belief that capitalism was an exploitative system destined to collapse. As early as 1946, the alliance that had defeated Hitler was fracturing. The Soviet Union had installed communist-friendly governments across Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. Nations that had been liberated from Nazi occupation now found themselves under Soviet influence. In March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The Cold War had not yet been named, but it had already begun. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman stood before Congress and made a declaration that would define American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The United States, he said, would support any free nation resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This became known as the Truman Doctrine. Its immediate purpose was to send military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey, both of which were under pressure from Soviet-backed communist movements. Its broader purpose was to contain Soviet expansion, a strategy that became known simply as containment. That same year, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion economic recovery program for war-devastated Western Europe. The intention was clear. Prosperous democracies were less likely to turn to communism. A starving, desperate Europe might not be. The Soviet Union refused Marshall Plan aid for itself and pressured its Eastern European satellite states to do the same. Instead, the Soviets established their own economic bloc, the Molotov Plan, binding Eastern Europe tightly to Moscow's economy. Europe was now divided, not by a formal border, but by ideology, economics, and the presence of opposing military forces. In 1949, 2 events dramatically escalated the tension. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, ending the American monopoly on atomic power and plunging the world into the age of mutually assured destruction. Second, China fell to a communist revolution under Mao Zedong, adding the world's most populous nation to the communist bloc. The Cold War was no longer just a European affair. It was global. In June 1950, the Cold War turned briefly, violently hot. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded the democratic South. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened. Over 3 years of brutal fighting, more than 36,000 American soldiers would die on the Korean peninsula. The war ended in a stalemate. The border between North and South Korea remained almost exactly where it had been before the invasion. Nothing had been won, nothing had been resolved. But the Korean War established a critical precedent. The two superpowers would wage their conflict through proxy wars, backing opposing sides in regional conflicts around the world, rather than confronting each other directly. Direct confrontation, both sides understood, risked nuclear war, and nuclear war meant the end of everything. Back in the United States, the fear of communism was taking on a life of its own. Senator Joseph McCarthy launched a series of investigations into alleged communist infiltration of American institutions, government, the military, Hollywood. Thousands of Americans were accused, investigated, and in many cases had their careers destroyed, often on the basis of little or no evidence. This period, known as McCarthyism, reflected just how deeply the fear of the Soviet Union had penetrated American society. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical competition, it was a battle for hearts and minds, at home and abroad. Throughout the 1950s, both superpowers invested enormous resources into their nuclear arsenals. The United States developed the hydrogen bomb in 1952, a weapon hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The Soviet Union followed with their own hydrogen bomb just 9 months later. By the late 1950s, both nations possessed enough nuclear firepower to destroy human civilization many times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became the grim logic that prevented either side from launching a first strike. If either nation attacked, the other would retaliate. Both would be annihilated. Peace, paradoxically, was guaranteed by the certainty of total destruction. The competition extended beyond weapons. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit. The American public was stunned. If the Soviets could put a satellite in space, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. The space race had begun. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space, another humiliation for the Americans. President John F. Kennedy responded with an extraordinary pledge. The United States would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. The Americans had won the space race, but the Cold War was far from over. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. American reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet nuclear missile installations being constructed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 days, President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a tense standoff that the world watched with terror. American naval forces blockaded Cuba. Soviet ships carrying more missiles approached. Military commanders on both sides prepared for war. What the world did not know at the time was that a Soviet submarine, surrounded by American warships and cut off from communication with Moscow, had been authorized to launch a nuclear torpedo if it came under attack. One officer on that submarine, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize the launch when the others wanted to fire. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through back-channel diplomacy. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans quietly agreed to remove their own missiles from Turkey. War had been averted by diplomacy and by the decisions of individual men under impossible pressure. The crisis led directly to the establishment of a direct communication hotline between Washington and Moscow, the famous Red Telephone, to prevent future misunderstandings from escalating to catastrophe. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the Cold War played out across the developing world. In Vietnam, the United States committed itself to defending the non-communist South against the communist North, backed by the Soviet Union and China. What began as a limited military advisory mission escalated into a full-scale war. At its peak, more than 500,000 American troops were deployed in Vietnam. The war became deeply unpopular at home. Protests erupted across American cities and university campuses. The nightly news brought the brutality of jungle warfare into American living rooms. After more than 58,000 American deaths and millions of Vietnamese casualties, the United States withdrew in 1973. 2 years later, North Vietnam conquered the South. Vietnam was unified under communist rule. It was a profound defeat, not just militarily, but psychologically. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was conducting its own proxy conflicts, supporting revolutionary movements in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. In Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and Afghanistan, the two superpowers armed, funded, and advised opposing sides in civil wars and revolutions. The world had become a chessboard, and ordinary people in ordinary countries paid the price. By the early 1970s, both superpowers were exhausted. The financial cost of the arms race, the space race, and decades of proxy conflicts had strained both economies. Under President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, the United States pursued a policy of détente, a deliberate relaxation of Cold War tensions. In 1972, Nixon made a historic visit to Communist China, recognizing the People's Republic for the first time and driving a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. That same year, Nixon visited Moscow. The two superpowers signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, agreeing to cap the number of nuclear missiles each side could deploy. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Cold War might be winding down. It was not. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, attempting to prop up a faltering communist government in Kabul. The United States responded by arming and funding the Afghan Mujahideen resistance fighters through the CIA. What followed was a decade-long Soviet quagmire, often compared to America's experience in Vietnam. The Soviets would lose 15,000 soldiers, millions of Afghans would die, and the Soviet economy would buckle under the strain. In 1985, a new Soviet leader came to power. Mikhail Gorbachev understood what many in the Soviet leadership refused to admit. The Soviet system was failing. The economy was stagnant. The military was overstretched. The technological gap with the West was widening. Gorbachev introduced two revolutionary policies: glasnost, openness, a relaxation of censorship and greater freedom of expression; perestroika, restructuring, an attempt to reform and modernize the Soviet economic system. These reforms unleashed forces that Gorbachev had not anticipated and could not control. Across Eastern Europe, populations that had lived under Soviet-imposed communist governments for 40 decades began to demand change. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union movement forced free elections. In Hungary, the border with Austria was opened. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution swept the communist government from power without a single shot being fired. And in November 1989, the event that symbolized the end of the Cold War more than any other took place. The Berlin Wall, the physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain, the barrier that had divided East and West Germany since 1961, was torn down by the people of Berlin. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the nation that had defined one half of the world's political order for nearly 7 decades, ceased to exist. 15 independent republics emerged from its dissolution. The Cold War was over. The United States stood as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War never produced a single direct military engagement between the two superpowers, yet its consequences touched every corner of the globe. It gave the world the nuclear age, the space race, and the internet, which grew from a U.S. military communications project called ARPANET. It also gave the world proxy wars that killed millions, authoritarian regimes propped up by both sides, and a legacy of political instability across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that endures to this day. The man in the Soviet bunker in 1983, Stanislav Petrov, was later asked why he didn't report the incoming missiles. He said simply that something felt wrong. The system, he believed, had malfunctioned. He was right, it had. He was never officially recognized by the Soviet government. He was quietly reprimanded for failing to follow protocol. But on that night, in that bunker, one man's judgment may have saved the world. That is perhaps the most important lesson of the Cold War. In an age of weapons capable of ending civilization, the fate of humanity rested not on missiles or ideology, but on the decisions of individual human beings. This has been the entire history of the Cold War.